Before the rest of London even knew it was morning, she was already awake. Not because she wanted to be, she did not need to be. In 1880, a woman of her position had not set her own alarm, drawn her own curtains, or lit her own fire in years, possibly ever. She woke because someone else had made it possible for her to sleep. And now that same invisible machinery of service had shifted into its next phase, and the day was beginning whether she summoned it or not. This is the story of a morning. Not the morning of the city. Not the morning of the factories or the docks or the market stalls, already groaning with cabbages and herring before the sun cleared the rooftops. This is the morning of a world that existed behind thick curtains, on streets so quiet you could hear the horses breathing, inside houses so tall and so perfectly ordered that their silence felt engineered. This is the morning of the Victorian aristocrat, and once you understand what it really looked like, you will never think about that era the same way again. Quick thing before we dive in, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely helps more than you know. London in 1880 was a city of nearly 4.5 million people. It was the largest city on Earth. It was the financial and cultural capital of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. An empire that at its peak would come to cover roughly a quarter of the globe. And at the center of all of it, not in a geographic sense, but in a social and cultural sense, was a class of people who had not worked for their position in any conventional meaning of the word. They had inherited it. They had been born into it. And they had constructed, across generations, a way of living so elaborate, so ritualized, and so deeply theatrical that even the act of waking up had become a performance. To understand the Victorian aristocrat's morning, you have to understand what the night before looked like, because the morning did not begin with a decision to rise. It began hours earlier in ways the aristocrat themselves would never see. It began in the basement, in a typical aristocratic London townhouse in Mayfair or Belgravia, the cream stucco neighborhoods of wide streets and columned porticos that even today carry the ghost of that era. The servants' day started long before dawn. The housemaids, who occupied the uppermost floors in the narrowest rooms, often rose at 5 in the morning or earlier. Their first task was not gentle. They descended to the main rooms of the house and cleaned the grates, the iron fireplaces that had burned through the night and were now filled with ash, clinker, and half-consumed coal. This was dirty, physical work. The grate had to be scraped clean, the fender and fire irons polished with emery paper, the hearth swept. And then, crucially, the fire had to be laid again and lit, so that by the time the family descended, every room they entered would already be warm. This matters because London in January 1880 was not simply cold. It was hostile. That winter, a fog disaster of historic proportions had settled over the city, described at the time as one of the worst in living memory. More than 1 million coal chimneys were burning simultaneously across the city, releasing sulfurous smoke that mixed with the natural Thames Valley mist to create something closer to a chemical event than a weather one. The air was brown and acrid. Visibility dropped to a few feet in certain neighborhoods. A pamphlet published in 1880 by Francis Rollo Russell, the son of a former prime minister, estimated that more than 2,000 Londoners had effectively choked to death in such conditions over recent years. Their existing lung diseases fatally worsened by the smoke, and yet the aristocratic household, insulated behind thick stone walls and the perpetual comfort of burning coal, filtered all of this through velvet curtains and the efficient warmth of fires that someone else had laid. This is the first thing to understand about the Victorian aristocrat's morning. It began not as an individual act, but as a collective production. Invisible hands had been working for hours before the first bell rang. And then, somewhere between 7 and 9 in the morning, depending on the household, the season, the social calendar, and the particular habits of the family, the lady's maid appeared. She did not knock loudly. She did not announce herself with noise. She entered the bedroom with the calibrated stealth of someone who understood that the transition between sleep and waking was, for her mistress, a kind of ceremony. She drew the curtains, first one side, then the other, in a specific order that the household had probably established by habit. She assessed the quality of the light, which in winter often meant assessing whether the fog had lifted or whether the window would reveal nothing but a dim yellow murk. She checked the fire, which the housemaid had already laid and lit. She brought, in many households, the first cup of the day, tea, or sometimes a cup of hot water, which some Victorian physicians recommended as the ideal way to begin the morning. She placed it on the nightstand, quietly, and then she waited. The lady's maid was one of the most peculiar figures in the Victorian household hierarchy. She was not a servant in the rough sense. She was educated, usually skilled in needlework, often trained in hairdressing, sometimes French, or at minimum expected to carry a certain elegance of manner. She was, in the language of the era, an upper servant. Her wages were modest by any modern standard, somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds a year in many households, but she occupied a position of enormous intimacy. She knew her mistress's moods before the mistress did. She knew the condition of every garment in the wardrobe, every small physical complaint, every anxiety that the social calendar produced. She was a confidant who was not allowed to be a friend, a presence who was expected to be invisible, a person whose entire professional skill set was organized around the comfort and appearance of one other person. And on this particular morning, her primary task was transformation. The aristocratic lady did not simply get dressed. Getting dressed was a structural process that could take the better part of an hour and involved multiple stages, each with its own logic and its own physical requirements. It began with washing. In 1880, most aristocratic households did not yet have indoor plumbing in the modern sense, though London's network of water mains had been expanding significantly throughout the mid-Victorian period. Private bathrooms with running hot water were still a relative novelty. What most bedroom suites contained instead was a washstand, a marble-topped cabinet with a ceramic basin, a pitcher of hot water the maid had carried up from the kitchen, and an array of toiletry items arranged with deliberate precision. A jug of cold water for temperature adjustment, soap, soft linen towels. Sometimes a bath was prepared in a portable tub that would be carried into the room, filled with cans of hot water, and covered with a large towel to retain the heat until the moment of use. There was a ritual quality to Victorian washing that went far beyond simple hygiene. Victorian beauty culture, especially for women of means, was an elaborate practice with its own rules, its own products, and its own ideology. The ideal complexion was pale. Pimples and blemishes were regarded not merely as cosmetic problems, but as failures of self-discipline or health. Women washed their faces with water infused with flower petals, rose, lavender, chamomile, and applied cold creams made from ingredients like almond oil, elderflower, and lemon. These were followed by fine face powders. Makeup existed, but operated under strict cultural prohibition. In polite society, visible cosmetics were associated with theater and prostitution, and so the ideal was to use them in ways that were completely undetectable, producing what one contemporary writer described as a look so natural that even your own mother could not tell where her daughter ended and art began. The corset came next, and this is where the physical reality of the Victorian morning becomes genuinely difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. By 1880, the fashionable silhouette for women demanded a waist that was dramatically nipped in, producing an hourglass profile that required mechanical assistance to achieve. The corset of this period was not a light undergarment. It was a structured, boned apparatus, often stiffened with whalebone or steel, that encased the torso from just below the bust to the hips and was laced at the back. It required assistance to put on. The lady's maid was essential at this stage, pulling the laces tight to achieve the desired measurement, adjusting the garment, and fastening the complex series of hooks and eyes that held it closed. There is genuine historical debate among scholars about the degree to which tight lacing was practiced in the 1880s. The most extreme forms of corsetry, the kind that appeared in sensational press accounts and reformist pamphlets, were probably not universal. Many women of the period wore corsets that shaped rather than severely compressed. But even moderate Victorian corsetry changed how a woman breathed, moved, and sat, and it fundamentally shaped the tempo of her morning. You could not rush into a corset. You could not dress yourself in one without considerable effort. It was, in a very literal sense, a structure that demanded patience, assistance, and the acceptance of physical constraint as a precondition of social presentation. Over the corset came layers: a chemise, a petticoat, a bustle, the architectural undergarment that gave the back of the Victorian skirt its characteristic shelf-like projection, a silhouette that dominated fashion through the early 1880s before beginning its gradual retreat. Then the dress itself, which for morning, the domestic hours before luncheon, and any formal calls, would have been simpler than the gowns of the afternoon and evening. Morning dress in the 1880s was still elaborate by any reasonable standard, but it operated on a different key. Darker colors, less ornamentation, more practical cuts. The distinction mattered enormously in this world, because what you wore communicated exactly what moment of the social day you were occupying, and appearing overdressed for the morning was as socially legible as appearing underdressed in the evening. The hair came last. Victorian hairstyles of the 1880s were complex architectural achievements, pinned and coiled and padded into precise arrangements that could take 15 minutes to an hour to complete. The lady's maid brushed, twisted, and pinned, working from established patterns that she and her mistress had developed through habit. Some women wore hairpieces or pads to add volume to arrangements that the natural hair alone could not produce. The whole process, from washing through to the final arrangement of hair, might take an hour and a half. Some households documented it as closer to 2, and through all of it, the mistress sat or stood as the passive center of an active process, being assembled rather than assembling herself. If you're enjoying this so far, go ahead and hit like. It really helps the channel grow. Now consider this for a moment, because it is one of the things about the Victorian aristocratic morning that modern viewers most consistently misread. The elaborate dressing ritual, the corset, the layers, the hair, the sequence of garments, is often interpreted as vanity, or as oppression, or as evidence of the essential frivolity of the upper class. And there is truth in the critique of restriction, particularly the physical restriction that female fashion imposed on women's bodies and movement. But the ritual was not primarily about beauty in the way we understand beauty. It was about legibility. In 1880, the way you looked was the way you communicated. There was no digital self-presentation. There were no photographs in your pocket, no Instagram profile establishing your identity for strangers before they met you in person. What you wore, how your hair was arranged, what fabrics your garments were made of, what condition they were in. All of this transmitted information about your class, your income, your social position, your marital status, and your adherence to the unwritten codes of your world. Getting dressed was not decorative, it was linguistic. And getting it wrong, appearing in the wrong garment at the wrong time, wearing a silhouette that had passed, failing to signal your position through the details of dress, carried real social consequences in a world where consequence operated through reputation. This is one of the reasons the lady's maid was so important. She was not just a personal servant. She was a specialist in a visual language that required constant maintenance to speak correctly. There is another layer to this that is easy to miss when we focus only on the lady being dressed, and it has to do with the emotional architecture of the morning itself. The Victorian aristocratic woman's life was not, by modern standards, a life of freedom. Her morning ritual of dressing was also, in a very real sense, a morning ritual of preparation for scrutiny. The world she would move through after breakfast, the calls she would make, the calls she would receive, the park she might ride through in the afternoon, was a world that would be watching her with a precision we no longer apply to one another. Her dress would be assessed. Her manner would be measured. Her correspondence choices, her social alliances, her management of the household, her handling of her husband's reputation and her children's prospects, all of it was subject to the continuous, unspoken appraisal of her class. Getting dressed was not a way of expressing herself. It was a way of preparing herself to be read. And what is striking about that, from this distance, is not the cruelty of it, though the restriction was real, but the degree to which these women became extraordinarily competent at surviving it. The lady's maid was a professional ally in a social battlefield. Together, mistress and maid developed a shared expertise in how to navigate a world that required constant performance. There is something almost moving about the relationship. When you look at it clearly, two women of vastly different social positions, brought into an intimacy deeper than most modern professional relationships, each knowing things about the other that neither would ever speak aloud. While the lady was being dressed, what was happening on the other side of the household? The gentleman's mourning followed a different but parallel ritual, managed by his valet. The valet was the male counterpart of the lady's maid, a personal servant whose entire professional focus was the grooming, clothing, and physical presentation of one man. By 1880, shaving was still almost entirely done by someone else in aristocratic households, or at minimum done with considerable assistance. The valet laid out the shaving implements, the brush, the soap, the razor, and often performed the shave himself. He had selected and pressed the clothing for the day before the morning even began, consulting a mental model of his employer's schedule and choosing appropriate garments for each anticipated activity. The gentleman's wardrobe was as coded as the lady's: morning coat for domestic hours, frock coat for calls and town business, different hats for different occasions, different gloves for different purposes, and the valet was the keeper of that code. The gentleman's mourning also involved a form of physical movement that the lady's mourning typically did not. Historians and contemporary accounts suggest that it was considered appropriately masculine for a gentleman to begin the day with some form of physical activity: a brisk walk in the garden if the weather permitted, a session of light exercise, or, in some households, a morning ride. The cultural ideal of the Victorian gentleman included a certain robust physicality that was distinct from the more decorative ideal applied to women. And crucially, the etiquette of breakfast reinforced this. A man who took his breakfast privately in his own room, rather than descending to join the family, risked being perceived as insufficiently vigorous. The word contemporaries sometimes used was effeminate, which tells you a great deal about the gender anxieties encoded in even the most mundane domestic arrangements. Breakfast, then, was a significant event. Not in the sense of a formal occasion. It was understood to be the most relaxed meal of the day, conducted in what Victorian social codes referred to as morning dress, which in practice meant considerably less formality than the afternoon or evening. But the food itself told a different story. An aristocratic breakfast in 1880 was not the light morning meal we might associate with elegance. It was substantial. Often, it was kept on a sideboard as a rolling spread, allowing members of the household to serve themselves and eat at slightly different times without the rigid formality of a seated service. The dishes typically included cold meats, game, perhaps, from the country estate, or cold roast beef, alongside freshly cooked eggs, bacon, sausage, kidneys, kippers, toast, marmalade, and pastries. Coffee and tea were both available. Fresh fruit might appear at the end. This was the version of simplicity that the aristocracy claimed, a meal that a Victorian laborer's family could not have afforded for a week, consumed in the privacy of a dining room heated by a fire the housemaids had lit 2 hours earlier. And then, and this is the detail that most dramatically sets the Victorian aristocratic morning apart from anything we experience today, the post arrived. By 1880, London had one of the most extraordinary postal systems in the world. The penny post, introduced in 1840, had transformed letter writing from a luxury into an everyday practice, and by the later Victorian period, London enjoyed multiple deliveries per day. The morning delivery arrived while the family was still at breakfast, and it was understood to be one of the defining rituals of the domestic morning. Letters were sorted by the butler and brought to the table. What the mail contained mattered enormously. It was how social appointments were confirmed, invitations accepted or declined, family news communicated, and business conducted. The Victorian aristocrat's social world was managed almost entirely through correspondence, and the Morning Post was the moment when that world made contact with the household. The newspapers came with the Post, or shortly before. The Times was the paper of record for the ruling class, but by 1880, the Morning Post was particularly associated with fashionable society, covering the movements and entertainments of the aristocracy with an attention to social detail that served both as news and as a kind of collective diary of the upper class. Reading who had dined where, who had arrived in London from their country estate, which balls had been held, and who had attended, this was not idle celebrity gossip in the modern sense. It was intelligence. The aristocratic world operated through social networks, and knowing its geography, who was in town, who was not, who was rising, and who was falling, was a form of practical knowledge with direct consequences for how you planned the coming days. The gentleman read the newspaper. The lady, in many households, read the letters. Together, over a breakfast that a servant had prepared and another servant would clear, they assembled a picture of the social landscape they were about to enter that day. And the social landscape they were reading about was, by 1880, a place of unusual complexity for the aristocracy. The landed gentry had dominated British political and cultural life for centuries, but the decades since the Reform Act of 1832 had been slowly, persistently eroding certain certainties. Agricultural incomes, the bedrock of aristocratic wealth for generations, were under pressure from imported grain that the expanding railway and steamship networks were making ever cheaper to bring to Britain from the Americas. Some of the great old families were quietly struggling. Others were doing what unthinkable things their grandparents would never have countenanced, marrying into money. American heiresses were beginning their famous crossing of the Atlantic, bringing railroad and industrial fortunes to exchange for titles and the social standing that British aristocracy still commanded. The newspapers reported on these marriages with fascination, recognizing in them a signal of something changing in the old order. The aristocrat at breakfast, who read carefully enough, could feel the ground shifting beneath the beautiful floors. The thing that sits just underneath the velvet surface of all this ritual and comfort and carefully maintained beauty. It was built on a structure of labor that it required to be invisible. In a typical London townhouse of this period, the family of an aristocrat, perhaps 3 or 4 people, was maintained by a staff that might include a butler, a housekeeper, a cook, a lady's maid, a valet, 2 or 3 housemaids, a footman or 2, a coachman, and sometimes a governess if there were children. These were not peripheral figures in the household. They were the household in the functional sense. They rose earlier, worked longer, and occupied the basement and the upper floors and the spaces between walls that made the family's life feel effortless. The housemaid who lit the fire at 5 in the morning and then cleared the grates and dusted the drawing room and carried the hot water up 3 flights of stairs had, before the family even descended for breakfast, already put in a morning's labor. And she did this in a city where the contrast between her world and the world she served was so extreme as to be almost incomprehensible. The East End of London in 1880, not a distant place, barely 3 miles from Mayfair, was another planet. Mortality rates in the poorest parishes were catastrophic. Life expectancy for male laborers in certain districts was documented in contemporary records as being in the mid-20s. Children worked. Families of 6 shared single rooms. The Thames, into which much of the city's sewage still flowed, despite the improvements of the 1860s, was a running crisis of public health. The fog that the aristocrat filtered through velvet curtains was the same fog that the factory worker breathed without any protection at all, and which caused the respiratory diseases that killed Londoners by the hundreds in the bad winters. This is the context that the Victorian aristocratic morning lived inside without ever quite acknowledging. The ritual and the beauty and the elaborate performance of elegance were not separate from this reality. They were, in a very real sense, produced by it. The coal that warmed the bedroom was dug by men whose life expectancy was shattered by the work. The starched linens that covered the breakfast table were laundered by hands that were raw and cracked from the effort. The food that appeared on the sideboard had moved through a supply chain of labor that the person eating it was not culturally encouraged to think about. The Victorian aristocracy did not invent this arrangement, and they did not, for the most part, consciously design it. They were born into it, as their parents had been, and their grandparents before them. They understood their position, and this is important, not as an accident, but as an order. The old hereditary aristocracy of Britain had constructed, over centuries, a system of thought in which their place at the top was natural, ordained, and essentially good for the society below them. They were the stewards of tradition. They were the anchors of civilization. Their morning rituals were not symptoms of excess. They were, in their own understanding, the visible expression of what civilization looked like when it was functioning correctly. And yet, the 1880s were also the moment when this certainty was beginning to crack. Quietly, at first, almost imperceptibly, but crack it was. The Reform Acts had expanded the franchise. The middle class had grown so substantially in wealth and influence that it was forcing its way into spaces previously reserved for blood alone. New money was appearing in old drawing rooms, and old money was retreating from positions it had previously held without question. The political system was shifting. The social codes were bending. Someone who followed the newspapers that arrived at the breakfast table with sufficient attention could have seen, in the events reported there, the slow-motion transformation of the world they were sitting inside. But on this particular morning, in this particular house, with the fire burning and the toast cooling on the silver rack, and the letters sorted, and the newspaper folded back to the society column, the transformation was still, for the moment, theoretical. The morning was what it had always been. The valet was pressing the afternoon coat. The lady's maid was attending to the correspondence box. The housekeeper was below, managing the day's accounts with a ledger that tracked every expenditure from the wine cellar to the housemaid's soap. The cook was planning the luncheon, which would require coordination with the kitchen maid and the scullery maid and the delivery boy, who would arrive with the fishmonger's order at the back door. The footman was polishing the front door brass until it caught the pale light. And in the drawing room, the light, such as it was, filtered through London's characteristic winter murk, softened further by the curtains, warmed by the fire, fell across a room that had been made to look exactly as it was supposed to look. Ordered, elegant, permanent. This is what a Victorian aristocratic morning felt like from the inside. A world that had arranged itself for the exclusive purpose of making this one family's existence feel like the natural condition of things. And this is what it looked like from slightly outside. An extraordinary performance, produced by dozens of people, choreographed across years of established practice, and sustained by a social agreement so deep that most of the people involved, both the family and the servants, had internalized it as simply the way the world was. The morning would continue into a schedule of calls, the ritual of the afternoon visit, when card leaving and receiving became the primary social currency of the upper-class day. There would be a luncheon served in the middle of the day to a table laid by the footman with a precision that a military officer might have recognized as a form of drill. There would be correspondence to write, the thank you notes, the acceptances, the declines, the careful letters of social maintenance that kept the networks functioning. In the evening, very likely, a dinner, the great formal meal that required yet another change of dress, yet another mobilization of the serving staff, yet another performance of the codes that defined this world and separated it from all others. But all of that came from this, the morning. The fire that was lit before dawn by hands that would never be thanked for it. The water that was carried up 3 flights of stairs in painted cans that were designed to look ornamental. The corset that was laced with practiced hands. The breakfast that appeared on the sideboard as though it had always been there. The newspaper that carried the social intelligence of a city at the height of its power. The letter that would be written in response to the invitation received in the Morning Post.
All of it, the whole elaborate, beautiful, unjust, fascinating machinery of it, began here in these first hours, in a house that the city was already building around before the family inside it had opened their eyes. Did you already know about this? Drop a comment and let me know what you think, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's a lot more Victorian life left to explore. A like goes a long way, and it genuinely means everything to the channel. One final thought, because this is where history earns its relevance. We look back at the Victorian aristocratic morning and we see something remote. The corsets and the calling cards and the coal fires. It feels like a museum exhibit, something behind glass. And in the obvious sense, it is. No one is being laced into a whalebone corset this morning.
No one is waiting for the butler to bring the letters, but the deeper structure that morning expressed, the idea that certain people's comfort is the natural purpose of other people's labor, that some lives are arranged to be beautiful while others are arranged to make that beauty possible, is not as remote as the velvet and the silver suggest. Every era has its version of this arrangement. Every era has its form of invisible service. What changes is the degree to which we are willing to look directly at it, to name what we see, and to ask whether what we call civilization is truly serving everyone it claims to include. The Victorian aristocrats' morning was extraordinary. It was also, in ways that the people living it were not fully equipped to see, a kind of dream, rich and vivid and internally coherent, and resting on foundations that could not, ultimately, hold. That morning ended. That world ended.
But the questions it asks are still here, waiting every time someone wakes up in comfort and does not think about who made that comfort possible.